Once again, welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover with you. One is if you are having any technical difficulties, problems with the audio, or issues with the screen, please feel free to contact GoToWebinar Technical Support at the number at the top of the screen, or if you don't see the screen, they're at 888-259-8414. And they'll work with you to get you online and into the webinar as quickly as possible. Today's session will be recorded. If you'd like to review it at a later time or forward it to others. And you should receive a follow-up email within the next couple of days with instructions on how to get a copy of the recording. Because we are recording this session and to preserve the sound quality, all attendees are on mute. Feel free to use the questions panel at the bottom of the webinar dashboard, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A time at the end of the session. Today's webinar is hosted by Planisware, a global provider of enterprise PPM software solutions. Planisware has over 17 years of experience in new product development and portfolio management. Our goal is to help organizations manage resources and costs efficiently, to build confidence in the business decisions that are driven from them, and thereby increase the value of your R&D portfolio. Effectively improving the value of your portfolio requires a multi-pronged approach. You need management commitment, established repeatable processes, and you need good supporting tools and infrastructure. But with all of that, how do you know that you're focusing your efforts and investments on the right processes and the right issues to maximize your ROI on your new product development investments? That's why when Dr. Menke of Value Creation Associates presented his benchmarking report on portfolio management best practices to us, we were so excited to have an opportunity to share what he has learned with the rest of you. My name is Keith Duncan, and I'm the Director of Innovation and PPM Practices here at Planisware. I've been working with companies in a variety of industries for over 12 years, helping them implement effective product and project portfolio management processes. Our featured presenter today is Dr. Michael Menke. Dr. Menke has over 40 years of experience helping clients with strategy, major decisions, and portfolio management. He helped develop and deploy many of the portfolio management approaches and tools in common use today. He continues to be an active thought leader and advisor on portfolio management tools, methods, and best practices. Dr. Menke, thank you for joining us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Keith.
Our agenda today, we've already gone through our welcomes and introductions. We're then going to go into a study, an overview, the significance of what Dr. Menke has uncovered and some of his key findings. Then we're going to transition and look at some of the most critical best practices that his research has shown. And then we'll wrap it up with some final thoughts and some questions and answers at the end. To get things started, what I'd like to do is have everybody answer a poll question for us, which is, have you formally benchmarked your portfolio management practices and processes against others in your industry or industry best practices? And if you could respond either with a yes or a no, that would give us some baseline information for the rest of the presentation. We'll leave the poll open for just a couple of more seconds. It looks like most people have voted. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll.
Pretty simple result here. A third say yes, 2/3 say no, 33% to 67%. So apparently there is a lot to be learned from benchmarking, and it'll be somewhat new territory for some of you. Thanks for your answers.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. So let's begin by looking at the study overview that Michael Menke and his associates developed. Look at the significance and key findings. Dr. Menke?
Thanks, Keith. Can we see the next slide, please? So there are a number of overarching objectives of portfolio management, but indeed one of them is surely to create business value. And this is very hard to prove because in R&D, we're only creating the potential for our businesses to really go out and earn money that gets reflected in our earnings, our share price, etc. But a number of my colleagues from Strategic Decisions Group who worked with most of the global pharmaceutical industry and had a good idea of who was really seriously adopting portfolio management, and this was mid-90s to early 2000s, created an index of the strong adopters, which you see here compared to the Dow Jones Pharma Index, which would be basically all publicly traded pharma companies, and then the S&P 500 over the same time periods. And what we can draw from this, what we can conclude from this graph is there's a strong association of portfolio management usage and value creation in the pharmaceutical industry, where managing the R&D portfolio well is absolutely critical to future business success. I'm not saying, by the way, that this proves causality, but there's clearly a strong association, which is, given that we're talking R&D portfolio management and the ultimate business results are pretty far in the future, I think that's about as good a test as we can get. Next slide. Now, portfolio management, as Keith already mentioned, is to support good management decisions on which projects and programs get funded and which, although they may be very good, have to be set aside. What influences decision-making generally, not just in portfolios, but any decision? Well, the culture and incentives in the organization are probably the most powerful drivers of decision behavior. But then there's behavior itself, which is the more explicit manifestation of culture and incentives. Then there could be a formal decision quality framework, and I'll use DQ in the presentation for decision quality. There is the decision-making process, and then finally there's your decision-making or decision quality methodology and tools. And the benchmarking I'm going to report on today is really focused there in the middle: decision behaviors, decision quality framework, decision process, and the practices that make those things come alive. Next slide.
So we have another poll question, and that reflects on where your organization is today, which is, does your organization have a formal decision quality process and use tools and frameworks to improve your decision making? We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to vote on this. Okay, we're going to close the poll here in just a couple of seconds. We have about 80% of you have responded so far. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll and take a look at what we've learned.
Well, everybody seems to, with the, it's 14% say no. But the vast majority of people are saying yes in some parts of our organization, or yes for some types of decisions. And that's about 40% each. And finally, broadly throughout the organization, this is still pretty rare, and I'm not surprised by that. But it's good to know, and by the way, since some of you probably ticked a couple of these boxes, we add up to Well, no, I guess we add up to exactly 100%. So perhaps we got just what we expected. Everybody picked one of those answers. But I'm glad to see that in the vast majority of organizations, 86%, it's either in some parts for some types of decisions or very broadly. Keith, next slide. So the framework applies generally to making quality decisions, but also to portfolio decisions. Now, portfolio and incentives are extremely important, as I said, but they're very hard to change. That's why I decided to focus on decision behaviors and practices, decision quality framework, and decision process. And this benchmarking has been underway in a series of rounds since 2011. I had a European partner, so we got companies from the US, companies from Europe, even a Japanese pharmaceutical company, Takeda, participated. And so we now have a database on 50 best practices where we asked people about their importance, how well they're executed, and established performance standards on those 50 practices. The 50 practices, by the way, largely were drawn from prior benchmarking studies, including a very large study done with the Industrial Research Institute in the early 90s by Bob Cooper and his colleagues that resulted in their well-known book, Portfolio Management for New Products. So these best practices were not something that I invented or created. I really largely extracted them. Many of them have been proven in prior studies. What we wanted to do was test how important people felt they were and how well they were executing them. Now, to establish a standard of excellence, we made sure, and I know a lot of companies and have worked with a lot of these companies, we made sure to include a number of companies that were very mature and were leaders in the use of project portfolio management. We now have data on over 70 organizations, including many leaders, and we're continuing to enroll new organizations. Any of you who are interested could contact me separately. Next. This shows you the people who participated in rounds 1 through 3. Some of these organizations have multiple participants. So, for example, you see Dow, several different units of Dow, several different units of Bayer, 3 different units of Rockwell Automation, and so on and so forth. A wide range of industries and functions, and as I said, the study is ongoing. Next slide, please. So we grouped our 50 best practices into 8 categories, and they all have a letter code that goes with them, which you can see on the pyramid here. Category A, added value of PPM. How do we create value? Why are we doing PPM? Category B, analytics, reporting, and risk assessment. Category C, management decision behavior. Categories D, E, and F are financial information, resource information, and strategic value information. And I think I would call each of those, I would substitute now information with information and management. So it would be resource information and management, strategic value information and management, etc. Then the foundation of the pyramid, category G, PPM organization and governance, and category H, the PPM process itself. Next slide. Just to show you an example of what the practices are. The first one is practically the thesis of Bob Cooper's book, and that is pursue 3 overarching objectives of portfolio management: strategic alignment, strategic balance, and maximum return. B5, show the impact of project risk on future project and portfolio value. C2, that's the decision behavior category. Decision-making by management is knowledge-based, transparent, and consistent. I'm sure that's true in all of your organizations. D3, Pretty obvious. Measure the strategic and financial value of portfolio decisions using a business case. And that actually means a business case for the projects, not a business case for the portfolio. E3, one of the most important and most weakly actualized or most poorly executed of all the practices. Do not overload the project pipeline or the people. Resource the projects adequately. Everybody says this is really important, and almost everybody says we're not doing a very good job of that. F1, another practice needing improvement. Have a well-defined business strategy and communicate it to all employees clearly and often. You would think that that's obvious and basic and everyone does it. But what people actually say is they're not doing it nearly as well as they think they should. G1, portfolio governance should be clearly defined and understood. H1, use a consistent PPM process language tools. There are additional practices that you'll see throughout the presentation, and the complete list is in a paper that's just been published in September-October issue of Research Technology Management. And if you don't have access to that easily, again, just contact me and I'll be able to provide it for you. Next slide. How did we score the practices? Well, basically, we asked each participant 4 questions with a fairly simple scoring system. First of all, is it relevant or not relevant to achieving your portfolio management objectives? And if it is relevant, is it actually something that's formally part of your portfolio management process? In which case, if it was formally specified that you do it, we called it a core practice. So this could either be no, relevant, or core. Then we asked for the contribution. If it's relevant, what is its contribution toward achieving your objectives, ranging from not at all important to extremely important on a scale of 1 to 7. So those were the questions about the importance of the practice. Then we asked 2 questions on usage. How frequently do you use it when appropriate? And how well do you execute it when you use it? And keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation that we combine frequency of use and quality of execution by multiplying the 2 of them, each on a scale of 0 to 100%, to get a number we call actualization. So actualization, you'll see a lot. It's our major performance metric. It's a pretty simple scoring mechanism, but it produces some pretty nice insights. Next. So the participant answers validate the best practices as important, and they establish a clear performance benchmark. The data on this slide are based on rounds 1 through 3, which had 44 participants. Round 4 had about 30 oil companies in it. That's why we're up to over 70. So based on rounds 1 through 3, all except 5 practices are considered core by 15 or more out of 44, and 10 by 30 or more. So that's core. That's not just relevant, but it means these are specified as things that we do in our PPM. Every practice is considered relevant by at least 25 of the 44 organizations, and 16 of the 50 practices by 42, 43, or all 44. Remember, this is the 44 participants in rounds 1 through 3. 6 of the 50 have an average contribution of 6 or higher on a scale of 1 to 7. And to be between the highest and the second highest on a 7-point scale, people are saying this is really important. And only 6 had an average contribution below 5. So you can see these answers were strongly skewed toward the extremely important, very important, rather important, the high end of the scale. On the other hand, actualization, again, the product of frequency of use times quality of execution, drops fairly rapidly from 66 to 33%, pretty significant range. But I then said, well, let's take for each practice the 3 best organizations and average their actualizations. And that top 3 group is usually above 80%, and on a number of practices, it's 100%. The message? Organizations can do these practices if they choose to, if they want to. And as you'll see later, practices that are important but have low actualizations, in this case we took below 45% as a cut line, are fertile ground to explore for gaining competitive advantage. Let's go on to the next slide. Just as an example, averaging all practices over all organizations in a particular grouping, the total population, again, this is the rounds 1 through 3, 44 organizations. Total population had an average actualization about 46%. R&D organizations perform better. Life science organizations, mostly pharmaceutical companies, but including one agroscience company, performed even better. And just as a point of reference, probably not many on this call from IT organizations, but IT organizations tend to perform not so well relative. They're below the total population and well below R&D and life science. But now if we say, what if we average the top 3 actualizations over all 50 practices? We get 88%. So it's really that top 3 actualization, which is a different 3 companies for each practice. That's what establishes our performance benchmark. Next slide. So here's a graph, practice by practice, that shows you what's the average performance. And again, this is based on the initial 44 organizations. And what's the average of the top 3 performers. And what you tend to see is the top 3 are about 40% higher on actualization than the average of everybody. So there's a very substantial gap between average performance and top performance. And that becomes our best in class. And again, I remind you that actualization is the product of how frequently do we use it times how well do we execute it, each scored 0 to 100%. Next slide. This is a little complicated, but it shows all the practices with contribution, the importance metric on the horizontal axis, and actualization, our performance metric, on the vertical axis. And then we first look at a quadrant where importance is above 5.4, average importance, and actualization is above 50%. And we see in there H1, H2, H3, H4. That's the PPM process category. We see G1, G3, G5. That's the governance category. And then we see a selection of other practices. So these are practices that are almost table stakes to do good portfolio management. The average company is doing them pretty well. You can imagine that the top performers, the top 3, are doing them very close to 100%, some of them probably at 100%. But let's now go down and look at the lower right quadrant instead of the upper right quadrant. This is practices that people think are indeed important. They make a high contribution to achieving our objectives, but we don't feel that we're doing them very well. So what do we see here? We see E1, E2, E3. That's the resource management category. And remember that E3 is do not overload the pipeline. So you see that is one of the weakest of all the practices, even though people know that they should not be overloading the portfolio, they do it anyway. We also see F1 F2, F4. F is the strategy category. So people are saying, yes, we know it's important to have a clear strategy and to communicate it well. Look, it's almost 6, but we're not doing it nearly as well as we should. We're down around 37%, and so on. So both the resource management category and the strategic information and management category tend to be weaker categories needing improvement. Now, this may not be the case in your organization, but this is what our average finding is. So if you can do these much better than the average company, you have a chance to gain competitive advantage. Next slide. Just to summarize the key findings, who does portfolio management well? Well, it was no surprise to me, because it's so critical in that industry, that pharma and healthcare was the best performing industry group. And in terms of functional findings, organizations executing mostly R&D projects score quite well. Organizations doing mostly IT projects, as a comparator, do worse. And you saw the data on that 3 or 4 slides back. What's being done well? People use both quantitative and qualitative measures. They have well-established and implemented criteria for decision making. There's pretty good alignment with regular planning and control processes, things like budgeting. And the whole categories of PPM process and PPM organization and governance are being done fairly well. But there's some issues in organization, as you'll see when we talk about improvement, that are a little on the weak side. Main areas needing improvement. Again, you've seen some data for this. Insufficient integration of PPM and resource management. Portfolio not well aligned with strategy, or even strategy unclear. People tended to feel they weren't doing nearly as good a job as they could with risk. How to consider risk both at the project level and the portfolio level. People didn't feel that their portfolio management was well aligned across different tiers of the company or different functions in the company. So there may be centers of excellence, but the process may be different in different centers of excellence. And finally, benefits management not frequently executed. You know, once the project is handed off, what's being done to make sure that the benefits anticipated get realized? And the results from all rounds have been very similar on these points. Next slide.
Thanks, Michael. A couple things that really impressed me there in that section. One was the depth of information that you were able to collect and correlate. And second was the fact that you were able to identify that set of best practices that most companies don't execute on well, which opens up competitive advantage that if organizations can focus on those areas, that they can get a leg up on their competition. But from there, let's go into the next level, and let's take a look at what you identified as being the most critical of those best practices.
Very good. Well, I tried to, many people have said, look, 50 practices is a lot. Can you boil it down? Can you? And that was the challenge that Planisware put to me. So I really went over and over the data and the findings, and I came up with 3 basic categories that I think are quite important. The first one is really objectives: strategic alignment, strategic balance, maximum return. Practices that relate to those 3 things. Then there's decision making itself. You really want to make excellent decisions, and that puts a burden on the senior executive team, those who are responsible for the decisions, the people who populate the governance body or the portfolio decision board. And then finally, this whole category of manage resources effectively. So let's look into category 1, objectives. So there were 3 practices that specifically related to strategic alignment. And I should just say that all three of those objectives are important if you want to have a holistic portfolio selection decision, not just a financially driven project ranking. One of the findings of the Cooper study with the IRI in the 1990s was that people whose portfolio management is purely financially driven actually perform worse than people who have a more holistic portfolio approach. So let's look at the strategic alignment practices. Well, we want a necessary and sufficient portfolio of projects guided by a clear strategy. And we had three practices that specifically related to that. F1, have a well-defined business strategy and communicate it to all employees clearly and often. F3, translate strategic goals and gaps into necessary projects. That is, build in your strategic alignment by understanding the gaps in strategy. But finally, once you've selected your portfolio, check that the projects in the portfolio are sufficient, that they are everything the strategy needs to succeed. Next slide. Just to clarify my own thinking, here's a graphic that I've used for a long time to try and say what's going on. In the beginning, we have all these project ideas, and fundamentally, they arise from the coming together of three sources. Number one is knowledge of what the strategy, what the market, what the customers, what the business needs are. Number two, what's the state of technology? What are the technology opportunities and challenges that, if we could overcome them, would really give us a competitive advantage? But the fundamental element that brings all that together is individual creativity. And obviously, every R&D organization knows that the quality of its people is key to success. But it's that downward arrow from strategy, market, business needs that creates the opportunity to build strategic alignment into the front end of the portfolio, into the very creation of project ideas. And that's why strategy needs to be communicated broadly throughout the organization, so people know what the strategy and what the business needs, so they can apply their creativity to it. That'll give us innovative, aligned opportunities, but most of our organizations are in business to make money. So we need to say, well, for those opportunities, and there are probably many more of those than we have people or money to fund, so we need commercial assessment, and we also need technology assessment. Very roughly, what's something like what's the NPV and what's the probability of success, coming up from the bottom. That would give us a set of high-value projects, and hopefully some of those projects with different resourcing options, so that we know that we could spend more or less and perhaps get greater or lesser performance out of the project. And in order, if we have that, and we do some commercial sensitivities and know the dependencies among projects, and if we do technology sensitivities and dependencies, that's what allows us to do some very rich portfolio analysis and come out with an optimal balanced portfolio. Key message, strategic alignment should be built in from the start. Keith?
Okay. Thank you, Michael. So when we look at what we see people doing in industry, one of the most common tools to help define and articulate and communicate the strategic vision is the roadmap. For those of you who aren't familiar with the roadmap, you can think of it as having three basic tiers. You have the know why tier. Why am I going to do these things? That's often called your marketing or environmental roadmap. What's happening in the marketplace, what's happening with my competitors, what's happening in the regulatory environment, what's happening in the world that's going to affect my product direction. The second layer then is the know-how. That's your technology roadmap. So you start now looking at what technologies am I working on? What technologies do I need to have in order to be successful? And then finally the know what. what products, what projects, what services am I going to bring to the market in order to meet those needs? And because a roadmap is inherently time-based, you also get to know when. So you know when these things are needed. And for companies who effectively execute on strategic roadmaps, that vision becomes very clear. This is where we're headed. This is why we're headed there. And these are the things that we need to do to be successful over time. That insight then leads you into understanding what are the gaps between where I want to be and the current direction that I'm heading in. And those gaps, as Michael put it, built-in strategic alignment of your portfolio can then be driven through your ideation. Companies that really excel at doing good idea management look at the strategy and they understand what are the gaps between where we say we're headed and what our current products and current projects are going to take us. And they use those to form idea campaigns. And these idea campaigns are very specific. They identify what are the core competencies and technologies that we want to leverage, who's our customer, when do we need it, what's our proposed price point, and you get it into a very specific set of boundaries that as people begin to ideate, they know this is what the company is looking for. So you get ideas that are actually a benefit to the company and it helps feed your strategy as opposed to just collecting ideas and then trying to sort out from them which ones actually fit our strategy, which ones fit our gaps and our needs. The other thing that I see that companies do very well in some cases and not so well in others is the use of quantifiable analysis on their projects. Two of the most valuable tools that we see are the scorecard and the project P&L. The project scorecard helps us assess not only what the attractiveness of a single project is, but it also helps us understand where does that project fit in the overall portfolio of what I'm doing. Companies that look at a scorecard as being something that is only a tool to help me get through the gate meeting. I have a hurdle rate that I have to score 65 out of 100 in order for me to get a go decision at a gate meeting, for example. Miss the most valuable part of a scorecard, which is not only to help you get through a gate meeting, but it's also to help feed into the portfolio. The same thing is true for your financial analysis. As you bring that financial analysis into your portfolio analysis, and you start being able to, and you're able to compare projects, and you're using your scorecards to figure out what is how aggressive and how balanced is your portfolio. Using this data outside of the context of a single project gives you a lot of insight on where you are in your strategic balance, in your strategic alignment, and in your financial view of your portfolio. Michael?
Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about balance, and I'll try and pick up the pace because I see our time is moving along. We had several practices relating to things like balancing risk and return. B2, use effective visual displays to convey portfolio information. B5, show the impact of project risk on future project and portfolio value. And there's a tool that many of you will be familiar with called the risk return grid that we first started using over 30 years ago at SDG. And I'll show a couple examples of that. But there are many other balances to be considered. Short-term, long-term. Are we serving all our geographies? Are we serving all our product markets? Are we serving all our, are we exploiting all of our technology capabilities, etc.? Next slide. So the risk return grid is a tool to help you balance risk and return. It's been adopted and embedded into many of the software. Here's Planisware's version of it. And on one axis, you have technical difficulty, often quantified as probability of technical success. And on the other axis, commercial potential, often quantified as net present value given technical success. Now that net present value might actually be averaged over a number of uncertainties in the market. But on the horizontal, whatever risk is reflected on the vertical axis is taken out of the horizontal axis. Then you can arrange all the projects there, and perhaps with colors and size of bubbles, show several other interesting dimensions. And you can use any terms you like. We've come up with the terms bread and butter, pearls, oysters, and white elephants. But let's go on to the next slide, because it's interesting that there are not only portfolio implications, but there are project management implications to these different parts of the grid. Bread and butter projects, that would be classic project management. Deliver it, manage specs, manage budget, manage schedule. Whereas with pearls, you don't necessarily want to manage the budget. You might want to overspend the budget to get the project finished quickly and start making a lot of money. Now down in the oyster category, and by the way, Mikimoto in Japan says it takes 20 oysters to yield a gem quality pearl, and some of you in the pharma industry or the oil industry might say that sounds like a pretty familiar risk ratio. What you want to do there is prove it. If it's going to fail, let it fail fast and fail cheap. So focus, which is not necessarily human nature, on doing the hardest things first. Try to get it to fail fast, because if it's going to fail, you'd like it not to fail late after a lot of expenditure. And finally, in the lower left with those white elephants, you'd like to move it, either up by simplifying the technical approach, over by expanding the commercial approach, or if it's not movable, maybe move it out and look for another, better, more valuable project. Next slide. Now, let's come to maximum return or value maximization. Very powerful, but shouldn't be done in isolation. You can't maximize value if you can't measure it. So one of our practices says use a value return measure that's aligned with shareholder value, such as risk-adjusted net present value. And that was a pretty highly actualized metric. Most people are in agreement with that. There are proven methods to optimize portfolio value. One of them I'll illustrate very briefly, but can't really take the time to explain, called the efficient frontier approach. And the efficient frontier approach and optimizing portfolios in general requires that you consider alternative project strategies. So the key message on value maximization is don't do it in isolation. Do it in the context of an aligned and balanced portfolio. Next slide. This is actually from reference 3. There's a list of references at the end of this deck, which you'll be able to get from Planisware. And if you have project alternatives that require fewer resources, that would be the reduced in the little fork diagram in the lower left. There's the current level of funding, reduced funding. Minimal means we spend only what's required to stop the project. And if you're in the middle of a clinical trial, that may require working the trial on through, but then abandoning that line of pursuit and maybe trying to license it out. And then, what could a project do with more resources? And through careful application of this technique, SmithKline-Beecham reported in the late 90s in the Harvard Business Review, they found for the very same expenditure, they could get 2.6 billion more value out of their portfolio simply by increasing the resources on projects that could really use it, reducing it on those that were to some extent overfunded, and dropping a small number of projects in favor of some of the expanded resource cases. So it is possible, and I've seen this in the oil industry, in the drug industry, in other places. There's very substantial value to be had in the range of 10 to 50% improvement in portfolio value from portfolio optimization. Keith?
Sure. So thank you, Michael. So what we commonly see in industry is that most companies are doing some form of portfolio reporting and using that portfolio reporting to help drive portfolio reviews and analysis. Simple bubble charts, similar to what we were just looking at with Michael help you get some insight into where you are as far as your balance, as far as the amount of risk that you're taking on. And typically we use things like the investment level in those projects to designate the bubble size, so we have an idea of what are the big bets that we're making versus what are some of the smaller projects that we're doing. The other thing that's always interesting is to look at those projects in terms of time. And so a pipeline funnel chart where we have, which is a form of bubble, but it tells us where we are in the process. How close are these projects to launch? Obviously, the closer we are to launch, the less benefit there may be in making significant changes to the project. Early projects are obviously much more open to change in scope or change in direction. And then on the value side, we often look at things like a cumulative revenue chart where we can see how the different businesses are contributing to the revenue over the next 3 or 4 years. So these types of views are the things that we commonly see most companies doing. And obviously going back to the quality of the data that we get from our scorecards and from our project P&Ls are going to drive a lot of the information that we have here and how much we trust this information when we go into those review meetings. The more sophisticated customers are oftentimes taking that raw project data and then they're creating scenarios similar to what Michael is referring to with the efficient frontier, where they look at projects and they say, what if we added more resource? What if we decided to cut back on the amount of functionality and therefore cut back on the price, but we get it to market quicker? What are the different things that we can do? And they take these scenario generations and then they start looking at what is the optimal scenario. And when you start getting into lots of things like that, then you start looking at some tools to help you out, looking at trying to optimize a single variable based off of multiple constraints. You may try to optimize my 2016 revenue while constraining what my capital investment should be, or perhaps I'm trying to optimize my risk-adjusted NPV while constraining my resources. But that type of analysis is really what we see being done by some of the best practice companies out there who really look at their portfolio in a very holistic way and have people who are really focused in on the fact that a project is not necessarily constrained to what it was defined as when it started. There are other alternative realities out there that we can work with in order to have a really good view of our portfolio. We now have another poll question I'd like everybody to answer, and we're going to give everybody about 1 minute to answer this one, which is, which of these 3 practices would you say you routinely and explicitly use in your portfolio management? So if we could get everyone to respond to that, we'll review the results.
And you are allowed to select multiple.
We have about 60% of the votes in. Okay, let's close the poll here in just a second. And let's take a look at the results.
Well, very strong on strategic alignment. Almost 3/4 of the people say yes. Balance and optimization are each around 1/3. So obviously those are areas where there is room for growth, room for doing more. Let's get back to the flow.
Sure.
So let's talk about portfolio decision making, and I'll try to be very quick here because I don't need to read you the slides. You'll be able to get these slides and pursue the information. Next slide. So there are a number of practices focused on portfolio management as a decision process. C1 and G1 are related to the governance process being well defined. The decision process should be transparent, that's C2. And finally, to make the decision real, resources have to be allocated in order to get the projects done. So to say, yes, we approve this project, but not to fund it with the required money and assign the people necessary to do it is not a real decision. Next slide. It's hard to change management behavior, but it can be done. Trying to change the culture in order to change management behavior is a very, very long process. So let's leave that one aside. But you may be able to set up cultural icons, if you will, and I'll show you an example from Intel. Something you can do that will change behavior in a positive way, if you do it right, in a shorter term, would be incentives. They're the shortest route to behavior change, but culture is the most durable, obviously. Next slide. Well, a good example of culture, which took decades to create and less than a decade, sadly, to dismantle, and I know because I was there during the dismantlement, was the HP way. There's a very nice book on it by Dave Packard. Here are some of the key points. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend that you study it, but it's not our main focus today. Let's go to something that you perhaps could do, and that is set up a set of management shared expectations. Intel, for example, had a very rough and tumble culture. You know that book, Only the Paranoid Survive, by Andy Grove. But in terms of decision making, they tried to really state this is the type of behavior we want and expect, and if people on a decision body are not behaving well, the others on the body should use this shared set of principles to call them out. Things like managers identify the decisions their organizations own and who the decision makers are. Decisions are owned by the individuals accountable for results. Every decision has one or at most two decision makers. The individual accountable for results is empowered to decide. Decision makers must clearly define process tools roles, must balance data with timeliness. Decisions are supported once they are made and clearly communicated to those affected. And these align very well with our best practices. Next slide. Another example is incentives. This is an example of things extracted from the performance review guidelines for leaders of leaders in a large Fortune 100 company. Things like balance the short-term and long-term impact of decisions, make data-driven, fact-based decisions. But my favorite is probably the last one. To be a team leader and personally effective, you need to be able to communicate the logic behind your decision. And what I always like to joke is, to communicate the logic behind your decision, there has to be logic behind your decision. Next slide. Well, let's just say a quick word about resources because we'd like to have time for questions. So it's essential to manage resources effectively. And there are three categories: anticipate and manage bottlenecks, and we had 5 practices in the study on that. Balance aggregate resource supply and demand, we had 2 practices on that. And finally, the infamous E3 that I spoke of earlier, don't overload the pipeline. And that was one of our very fundamental practices and one of the ones that was where we saw the poorest average performance of almost any practice. Keith, I suggest we skip the next slides, which simply expand on these.
We can do that.
And maybe even head into the question and answers. So there are some comments on all of these. Just go on. People can read this later.
Sure. So just a couple things to point out as we come to a close. One of them is that I've noticed over the last 3 or 4 years, if I go back 4 years ago and I asked people about resource planning, only a few companies that I talked to were really investing towards it. And the trend that I've seen over the last couple of years has been that everybody is really starting to focus in on this idea of doing effective bottleneck analysis, understanding what resources are needed in order for them to effectively manage their pipeline and to make progress towards it. So I would say I see a lot of people using charts and techniques like the one that you see here with the bottleneck analysis to effectively manage their resources. One of the things that all of this is relying on is that having the great strategy is important, and having the alignment and having the governance around it. But you have to also at the same time make sure that the project teams are properly equipped to provide the right information, and those project teams are running at a high efficiency. So tools like being able to run your projects through StageGate, having collaboration areas, having good project plans, all of which are essential to making sure that not only do you know what direction the train is going in, but you're making sure the trains are running on time. You see, as a result of that, a lot of people looking at views like this, where they're tracking the progress of their master project list, what projects are in trouble, which ones are on track, which ones are at risk, where does management attention have to be in order to make sure that the projects are going to execute as they were defined to go forward. And finally, all of this boils down to this idea of providing the executive teams with the data and the information that they need, what we call business intelligence, to ensure that they make the proper decisions. Michael Bloomberg has a sign in his office, and it goes along the lines of, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." You have to be able to bring the right data into the meeting in order to have the right, in order to empower people to make the right decisions and to have that effective decision framework. So we call that business intelligence, and that is that ability to pull all that information out of your projects, to know that the information in the projects is reliable and actionable, and then from there you can expect the right decisions to be made. So just some final thoughts on today's presentation, Michael.
Well, I have a grid here, and for many companies, I would focus on the practice categories in the upper right: resource management, strategy and strategic alignment, added value of PPM, purpose and objectives, and PPM organization integration alignment. And at this point, I would say we owe it to the crowd to tackle a question or two.
I'd say we have just a couple of minutes for some questions. So,
well, I've got several that I've already read through.
great.
And the first two that I see are from Dave Bolton and Eric Gabus, and they're both very similar. It's fundamentally, can you prove to me that the top 3 actualizers have better financial results? And there's a subtlety here. Remember, the top 3 actualizers are different for each of the 50 practices. So there is no such thing as the top 3 actualizers overall. Now, that they may say, that's beginning to sound like a politician, you know, you're weaseling out. It turns out that good management process can be overwhelmed by luck. Many of you may know that before the discovery of Zantac, which a tiny company, number 60-something in the world, called Glaxo, brought on in 5 years and 3 months from discovery to launch, Glaxo was a nobody. Was it their portfolio management that catapulted them into the top ranks of all pharmaceutical companies? Or was it incredible luck in a category that was really hot? So it's always going to be very tough to prove that good portfolio management, good decision-making, good budgeting, whatever, makes lots of money. I do anecdotally believe it from what I know, but proving it is very tough. There was a question on the optimization slide. That was slide 32, where I showed that shareholder value went up by 2.6 billion. I didn't say that shareholder value, the surrogate for shareholder value, which you can find in any major finance text, is net present value of future expected discounted cash flows properly adjusted for risk. Every top financial textbook says that. So we were using expected NPV as the shareholder value surrogate. And there's still a lot of complexity in that slide, and I refer you to reference 3. In fact, Keith, you could just flip to the last page and then we'll say goodbye.
Okay. Well, this is the last page.
Oh, you don't have the reference page?
Oh, I can. Sorry.
I just want people to know
go.
it's the... Yes. So here are 12 books and articles that will help you dig deeper into this. Reference number 2 is where many of the best practices were originally articulated. Reference number 3 is a good example of efficient frontier portfolio optimization in the pharmaceutical industry. And reference number 12 is the brand new paper about this best practice study in research technology management. Thanks a lot. I think we're over our time. Keith, do you want to say goodbye?
Sure. So, Michael, thank you very much for sharing this information with us and sharing your insights on it. If anybody has additional questions that we couldn't get to today or something occurs to you later, please email that to webinar@planisware.com, and we'll make sure that either myself or Michael gets the question and we get a chance to respond to you. And as I said earlier, the recording of the slides will be made available to you in a follow-up email that you should be receiving in the next few days. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good day. Goodbye.